Borthakur IAS Academy প্রস্তুতি আৰু অধ্যয়নৰ নিৰ্ভৰযোগ্য ঠিকনা Borthakur IAS Academy.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Hindu analysis. Hope you are all doing well and staying safe. Let us begin with the first article today. Human rights at risk in police stations, Chief Justice of India. So, Chief Justice of India N.V. Ramana has flagged routine custodial torture that takes place in our police stations. He was speaking at the release of the National Legal Services Authority's Legal Service app. During the interaction, he pointed out that police stations pose the highest threat to human rights and dignity, which are sacrosanct. He went on to add further that the threat to human rights and bodily integrity is the highest in police stations, and going by the recent reports, even the privileged are not spared third-degree treatment. Recently, we also discussed an editorial where torture by Indian police has been against its constitutional principles of respecting human rights and human dignity, where the author on prevention of torture was talking about Indian police need be trained in tactics that are averse of torture, custodial torture, or whatever it is. We must train our police not to use torture to get their convictions or their written confessions, right? We talked extensively how police are incentivized in India if they use torture as a tactic and get a written confession from an accused criminal so that they get a conviction, thereby increasing their conviction rates, right? We also talked about how Indian laws are skewed towards being acceptable of torture by police in police stations. We also highlighted a case where in Kerala a father and son duo were tortured, which later on led to their death, which was termed as a custodial death, and we haven't seen much action in regard to that case also. Subsequently, there has been multiple other cases where accused who are still to be presented in the court have been tortured by police, and this is not a one and done case, right? We have certain examples that highlight what Chief Justice of India is saying. We are also seeing repeated cases coming out of custodial torture, and as far as the police atrocities are, the CJA observed that both custodial torture and police atrocities still prevail despite constitutional guarantees. So how do you control this? There seems to we kind of established at various points of time in our classes was that bringing in legislation is not the answer to all of your problems. You need to bring structural changes, you need to bring guidance, you need to bring training. That is one way we could reduce whatever the torture that sometimes accused experience in police stations. You need to incentivize police not to use torture as a tactic. You need to train them in different ways, in different interrogation ways apart from torture, and police are also needed to be penalized to the highest degree if they found in breach of those guarantees in where they torture to get a written confession or an oral confession from an accused. So it's not a simple legislative issue. You bring in a legislation or a new law stating that we are not going to allow torture any longer in police stations, and the problem itself would go away. So it also talks about why police are torturing people, or why we are seeing repeated instances of custodial torture. Again, we also look at the human capacity of the police itself. The ratio of police personnel to population in a region is highly skewed. So in order to address this issue, right, you can say that lack of effect. Let us discuss the torture issue at first. So the solution, as I said, is not in legislation. It should be a structural reform issue. It should be a personal reform issue. You need to ensure the human capacity of the police force is also increased to a great deal, wherein we increase funding, we increase training hours, we increase intermittent training sessions, where every year a batch of police personnel in a police station go somewhere and get trained with new tactics, new methodologies, new sensitivities, and come back and rejoin the forces. So it has to be a complete and a 360-degree cycle process where it takes place year long. It's not one and done. You clear an exam, you pass the physical test, you go into the academy, you come out, and you never visit any other training institute or any other thing. So it should be a continuous process of growth at every level of a police or an police person's career. So that would be one way where custodial torture and police atrocities can be brought down through more training, by giving them more resources, by ensuring that they themselves are not stretched too thin. So to conclude, right, we need to ensure an overall overhaul of Indian police. It needs reforms, it needs more resources, it needs more training. So that is one way we reduce custodial torture. But we have to agree with the statement given by the CJI, Honorable CJI, that we are seeing a threat to human rights and bodily integrity are to be found highest in police stations, right? Even the privileged are not spared third degree treatment. This is I think he's referring human rights activists, environmental activists, any other kind of civil society that is protesting against any issue, who are being hauled up by the police. He points out to the fact that even they are not being spared by police in that case. The second aspect that the Honorable CJ has raised is the lack of effective legal representation. So when you talk about effective legal representation, we are seeing three kinds of divides in our society. One, if you are a privileged person, your access to or judicial reprieve is faster, easier and simpler. So your access to judiciary, if you belong to a lower socioeconomic spectrum of Indian society, your access to judiciary is almost nascent in some stages and non-existent in most of the cases. Even in order to be more accessible to people who cannot afford legal services, who cannot afford lawyer fees, then the judiciary itself needs to go through reform, right? That is when we talk about effective legal representation. The second aspect of that statement is effective legal representation at police stations. When a person is arrested, they themselves don't tend to have legal representation present at the station, or they don't know the process as to how to attain a legal representation when they are being processed by the police for a crime that they have been accused to commit. Because of lack of effective legal representation at police station, valuable time is lost in ensuring that a person who has been accused, there is a chance that they may not have to endure any kind of abuse in the hands of the police, or even if the person has legal representation at the police station itself, the case may need not to go in front of a court in order to be resolved. So the advantages of having effective legal representation at police station is huge and immense. It would reduce the burden on the police, it would reduce the burden on the judiciary itself, because if the case or the detained person is innocent, then the lawyer or the legal representative of the accused person can make a case stating that these are the facts, and the need for a case to be filed is non-existent, hence resolving the issue then and there, saving a huge amount of resources both for the police and the detained person and the judiciary system. So there are a lot of advantages. One, you have on one hand you have custodial torture, where you are seeing highest level of human rights violation taking place in police station that need reforms. And you talk about equity, the digital divide, then again you have to ensure that even the judiciary goes through its much needed reforms phase in order to ensure equity or equity access to all the people in our country. It shouldn't be no longer termed as the divide between the privileged and underprivileged, right? The judiciary itself have to work for the underprivileged, because these are the sections of the society that doesn't have neither the resources nor the access to judicial protection. The third aspect is having effective legal representation, not only in police station, at any other place also, right? If you are being accused, you need to have a proper legal representation during the case, when the case is being heard in court also. So it's a 360-degree approach. It's not only a police issue, it's not only a judiciary issue. When you talk about effective legal representation, it's an issue that converges at the police stations and also at courts. So it's kind of a three-pronged issue. One, you have torture. The second, you have legal representation at police stations, and access to judiciary services to the underprivileged. So the solution is, at the end of the day, reforms, ensuring more funding to these institutions, ensuring more training to the personnel. That would be one way out of to come out of all these problems. But remember, these things tend to take time once you see political will and resources being diverted in that direction. Until unless that point, these things are going to still persist for a long periods of time. Moving on to the next article, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recently came out with its sixth assessment report. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the international body for assessing the science related to climate change. Let us understand, before going into the articles itself, before discussing the impact climate change will have on India in future, let us understand what IPCC is. Right, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was set up in 1988 by the World Meteorological Organization (WMO) and the United Nations Environment Program (UNEP). The idea was that they would provide policymakers with regular assessments of the scientific basis of climate change, its impacts and future risks, and also provide options for adaptation and mitigation of effects of climate change. That was the idea that this panel on climate change was set up. So the intent behind the setting up of panel on climate change is that they would provide a scientific basis for governments at all levels, so that these governments can develop climate related policies that is based on scientific knowledge. They are sound in science. Now, these assessments provided by the panel on climate change underlie negotiations at the United Nations Climate Conference. They also provide help during or render help during the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change (UNFCCC). So they play an important role, and their reports have always been significant markers for policy framers. Governments around the world at various points of time have used the guidelines provided by the panel on climate change to formulate their own policy that is related to climate, right? That is how these reports have been helpful, and the Intergovernmental Panel has been instrumental in ensuring that governments adhere to the international norms in climate pollution control, and ensure that they are guided in the right way, that is entirely based on science, so that the policy have an effect. So they kind of ensure that the policy that is being framed by various governments kind of have some sort of convergence, so that at the end of the day the temperatures do not rise. On the second aspect of it, based on science, they would provide suggestions that are specific to that respective country, so that the policy can be more effective and the result would be much better. That is how the IPCC panel has been working since its inception, and it has been particularly working with developing nations and underdeveloped nations, so that their developmental approach and their growth would be entirely based on environment friendly factors. Now let us understand what this report talks about. IPCC report forecasts a future of severe weather. The sixth assessment report, which is titled Climate Change 2021, the Physical Science Basis. Now this has to be the most critical report that the panel on climate change has come out with. So to discuss of all the reports that the panel on climate change has come out with, the sixth assessment report has to be the most critical and comes with a dire warning for the world if they don't change or mend their ways. Particularly, it has given critical warnings to in context to India, because they have pointed out to the fact that the Indian Ocean is warming at a higher rate than other oceans, and as a result of this, the direct impact of this would be on India, because India would face significant threats from rising sea levels, and scientists have been warning that India will witness increased heat waves and flooding, which are again detrimental to our own development. So the scientists are warning that India will witness increased heat waves and flooding, and which will be irreversible effects of climate change. So not only that, India is also going to experience monsoon extremes, which are likely to increase over India and South Asia, particularly India, right? We are still a monsoon dependent country for our agriculture. While the frequency of short, intense rainy days are expected to rise, remember that one of the major effects of this short, intense rainy days is crop damage, which is significant. And in the past also, the amount of crop lost to these kinds of weather events has been high, and with the frequency increasing, we are going to see huge losses to our crops, our food security, and our farmer at the end of the day. So the report also pointed to the fact that the planet was irrevocably headed towards warming by 1.5 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial times in the next 2 decades, much earlier than the goal we set ourselves in the Paris Agreement, right? Keeping the global warming below 2 degrees Celsius of pre-industrial levels by the turn of century and enduring to limit it to 1.5 degree was at the heart of 2015 Paris Agreement. And by the way the things are, if the things continue on the same path, that goal is going to go out of the window and the barrier is going to be breached, right? The report suggested that countries strive to achieve net zero emissions with no additional greenhouse gases being emitted by 2050, which is a distant dream at this point of time. The reason is that we are seeing countries that are major contributors to greenhouse gases in the world are at loggerheads. On one hand, you have US, on the other hand, you have China, where they themselves are vying for positions or positions of power over climate change strategies. You have US on the one hand trying to come up with their own interpretation of the international agreements. Even Paris Agreement, they have recognized it as an international right. They pulled out of the Paris Agreement during the Trump era. Then when Biden administration came in, they came back into Paris Agreement. There are a lot of issues with the US itself being one of the major contributors to greenhouse gases. On the second hand, you have China, which though doesn't recognize these kinds of has an on and off relationship with these kinds of agreements and these kinds of reports, is now trying to come up with its own set of readings, its own set of scientific data that kinds of supports their stance that we are also, even they themselves came out with this carbon trading policy for their industries, even though there already exists a carbon trading policy that is recognized by various countries in the world. So you are seeing this issue being politicized to a greater extent, right? At the end of the day, you have science that actually says that the earth is warming, the climate change is real, and if we don't change our ways, things are going to get far worse. Now let us look at some of the observations and forecasts that were made by the scientists on panel on climate change, right? Heat waves and humid heat stress will become more intense and frequent over Southeast Asia during 21st century. Even the US went through this phenomenon called heat dome recently, where because of the extensive heat wave caused by a weather event, many elderly people lost their lives. So we are going to see a repeat of similar events not only in Southeast Asia but also in South Americas and Americas. At the second observation that they kind of made was that both annual and summer monsoon precipitation will increase with enhanced interannual variability over Southeast Asia. This report particularly points to dire effects on Southeast Asia and Southeast Asian economies, which are to greater extent are either underdeveloped or still developing, barring few examples, right? The other observation that they made was that heat extremes have increased while cold extremes have decreased, and these trends will continue over the coming decades. So again, it's a process that will keep on continuing over the coming decades, right? The fourth aspect that they point out is glacier runoff in the Asian high mountains will increase up to mid 21st century, and subsequently runoff may decrease due to loss of glacier storage. So the solution is we won't see much glacier loss because there wouldn't be any glaciers left to melt. So that is kind of the irony here we are seeing, or that is the kind of future that stares in front of us if we don't change, or if we don't change our greenhouse emissions, right? The relative sea level around Asia increased faster than global average, with coastal area loss and shoreline retreat. Regional mean sea level will continue to rise, and this puts coastal areas, coastal developmental zones at greater risk of getting submerged underwater. India, with its 7,000 plus coastline, is prime location for loss of coastal line because of rising sea levels, right? When you look at the countries in this map, you have countries that are ranging from very high to very low. These are the trend, or this map points out to the countries where they are actually adhering to protocols that were set in the Paris Agreement. You have on one hand Russia, China, America, Canada, Australia, Saudi Arabia, and other countries, Iran, other countries that are not adhering to the pact, the Paris Agreement, Paris Climate Pact, and they are still continuing to increase or have increased their carbon greenhouse emissions output over the years, despite agreeing to the Paris Climate Accord. On the other hand, you have countries like India, England, and some other Scandinavian countries that are actually trying to reduce their greenhouse emissions. See, India is the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, but India is also one of the top 10 countries that are investing a lot into renewable energy resources. We are investing in new technologies where we are exploring both public and private partnership. We have recently an announcement from Reliance Group that is talking about exploring hydrogen technologies, which is not new to India, but new in terms of the scale that Reliance Industries is investing in that project. Whatever the projects that India saw in terms of hydrogen energy were very small scale, relegated to university campuses and some R&D labs. But what Reliance talks about is taking hydrogen technologies mainstream, which if converged with both solar energy, wind energy, nuclear energy, would be a game changer to India's energy woes. Right, these are the countries. That is how different each country is approaching their own goals that they themselves set in accordance with Paris Agreement. So to repeat again, India is currently the world's third largest greenhouse gas emitter, but per capita emissions are much lower compared to other countries, right? Based on existing commitments by the countries to curb their emissions, the world is on track for global temperatures warming at least 2.7 degrees by the end of 2100. And the US, as I said earlier, emitted nearly 9 times more greenhouse gases per capita than India in 2018 alone, right? At this point of time, when you say that the countries need to reach a net zero level, when you look at these numbers, when you look at these statistics, and when you go through this report in a staged manner, you get this understanding that maybe reaching net zero alone is not enough. You need to bring in more changes that not only set your goals at being a net zero economy, but talks about contributing to reversing the effects of climate change, which at this point of time are looking less and less likely, right? So moving on to the next article, code red. This again article talks about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This new report attributes to catastrophic events to sustained global warming. This is particularly the frequency and intensity of hot extremes, marine heat waves, heavy precipitation, agriculture and ecological droughts, proportion of intense tropical cyclones, reduction in Arctic sea ice, snow cover, and permafrost. Remember, whatever we are talking here, the permafrost, the snow cover, the reductions in Arctic sea ice, these are all detrimental to our own ecosystem, right? If these things go, we don't know what impact, we know what impact it would have on human life, but we cannot fathom the damage that it would cause us to the way of life that we have right now. right? It has been more than 5 years since the Paris Agreement was concluded, right? But still there is no consensus among countries that are signatory to the Paris Agreement itself on having a common ground or having a consensus on how to reduce emissions. Everybody is saying that we are going to reduce emissions, but no country is thinking alike. They have no consensus among the signatories itself, right? The solution is simple, right? You have to reduce emissions. One way would be to do that is to reduce your sources of emission. How do you do that? You try to invest in technologies that produce low carbon. And when you talk about new technologies, innovative technologies, less carbon emitting technologies, these technologies tend to be costlier. When you are a developed country, these technologies are not a problem. These are non-sequitur issues for you because you have the economic heft to invest into these low carbon technologies. What about countries that cannot afford these low carbon technologies? That is where other developed countries must step in to support these countries. But are we seeing these kinds of help from developed countries? We are seeing that, but not to the extent that these kinds of help or these kinds of support from developed countries to least developed countries will actually make a change in the developed or in the less developed countries' approach to climate change or carbon emissions. The second aspect is to adequately funding mitigation and adaptation technologies, right, or policies. Again, we are seeing the same divide that plagues our world. You see developed countries framing out policies that are actually funded, and you have on the other hand least developed countries or less developed countries that though they are willing to formulate policies, they don't have the financial backing to support and fund those mitigation plans and adaptation plans. So the issue of financial heft, the issue of their size of economy also comes into picture, right? Leaders at various points of time on various occasions in many countries have stonewalled and avoided moving away from coal and fossil fuels. At any point of time, if a developing country or a developed country's leader is asked, how are you going to answer the issue with fossil fuel plants or for use of fossil fuel or coal plants? The answer seems to be that we are working on coming up with new technologies, but the answer is still elusive. So leaders around the world have avoided moving away from coal and other fossil fuels, right? Even those who have promised, including the Canadian Prime Minister, whom kind of became the poster child for climate change and moving away from fossil fuel and coal, has been reinvesting into fossil fuel technologies and coal technologies, right? They kind of failed to influence the multilateral system that they kind of run around the world. One of the biggest impacts of COVID-19 was that it had marginally and temporarily reduced emissions, right? There was a depression in emission levels around the world because of COVID-19 and subsequent lockdowns that followed it. But again, for developed countries with legacy emissions, these are the countries that have contributed a large in the past and still are continuing. For them, effecting deep cuts is the only way out of achieving at least a net zero position in carbon emissions. The other aspect is to ensure a transfer of technology takes place from these developing countries to emerging economies without any strings attached, without any conditions attached. It should be given away free. It should be given away with additional funding along with it being given free. That is how you ensure equity between developed countries and emerging economies, right? You have to heavily fund mitigation and adaptation plans. Again, that is one way to solve this issue. And developing nations should have no hesitation in committing themselves to steeper emissions cuts. The idea or the defense given by emerging economies around the world for their non-compliance of carbon emissions goals is that we are still developing. We cannot afford these kinds of cuts on our emissions and these cuts that you are talking about come at the cost of our economic development. At this point of time, if you are talking about our economic development or pollution, we will always choose economic development, because at the end of the day we have to take care of our people. That is what China has been saying. At various points of time, India has also kind of said the similar things, but not in the same tone. And we have some many African countries and South Asian countries that are saying that if you are talking about emission cuts, if you are talking about low carbon emissions, these low carbon emissions come at a cost of our economic growth. But recently we are seeing an increase in number of wildfires, heat waves, extreme rainfall, floods around the world, Germany particularly, wildfires in America, Greece and other European countries. In recent times, these report kinds of lend scientific credence to the argument that whatever all the natural deadly weather events that we are seeing around the world are strongly influenced by climate change. So moving on to the next article that is directly related to the IPCC's report, glaciers will keep shrinking in 𝐻𝐾H, that is Hindu Kush Himalaya, right? One of the events that recently took place is flash floods in our Himalayan states. We have seen a large number of cases of flash floods, landslide, mudslides. We have also seen 2 cases of glacial bursts in this region. According to this report, according to IPCC's report, we are going to continually see glaciers in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region shrink over the next few decades. And not only that, we are also going to see the snow cover retreating to higher altitudes, right? The report points out to the fact that extreme precipitation is projected to increase in major mountainous regions, with potential cascading consequences of floods, landslides and lake outbursts in all scenarios. And we have been seeing similar cases in India taking place on an yearly basis in the last few years alone. And the economic cost and the human cost of these weather events have been huge, right? The second aspect is the snow cover has reduced since early 21st century, and the glaciers in this region have thinned and retreated and have lost mass since 1970. The scientists who contributed to the reports, this report points out to the fact that despite seeing large loss of glacial ice, snow cover in high regions of Hindu Kush Himalaya, and the real risk of snow cover being retreating to higher altitudes, one silver lining is that the Karakoram glaciers have either slightly gained mass or were in an approximately balanced state. But that is not the baseline here. We are actually seeing loss of ecosystem in this region, and the pace at which we are seeing the loss is actually much faster than what scientific models have predicted over the years. So moving on to the next article, nation first, always first, theme for I-Day events, right? The theme for India's 75th Independence Day celebrations at Red Fort is nation first, always first. That is the theme. This is again an interview on the prelims point of view. I just wanted to point out that the theme for 75th Indian Independence Day celebrations is nation first, always first. So moving on to the next article, PM sets out framework for maritime security. We know that India is currently the president of United Nations Security Council for the month of August. And in that regards, Prime Minister Narendra Modi chaired a debate on maritime security, and the debate was titled as Enhancing Maritime Security, a Case for International Cooperation. During this debate, India presented a 5-point formula to ensure free and fair seas in the world. In regards to that, the United Nations Security Council adopted presidential statement which was formulated by India, which reaffirmed that the United Nations Convention on Law of the Seas is established and a legal framework for maritime activities be restored, right? The Union Clause is the legal framework for maritime activities around the world and in the high seas. And because of Chinese activities in South China Sea, and because of Russian activity in the Baltic and area in the seas surrounding the Ukraine area, there has been a dispute that has been brewing between countries in that region and around the world, and reaffirming the fact that we already have a convention on laws of the sea, and we have to ensure that the legal framework be put in use. So during this debate, Prime Minister Modi outlined 5 principal frameworks for the debate. The first one was removing barriers to maritime trade, where we highlighted the Sagar mission. Sagar is security and growth for all in the region that India launched. It is a framework proposed by India for regional maritime security in the year 2015. The second is maritime dispute should be resolved peacefully in accordance with international law. The third was that countries jointly tackle maritime threats from non-state actors and natural disaster. This is both in Malacca Straits and the Strait of Hormuz, where we are seeing large provocations from both Iran, from pirates in the high seas, and there are multiple issues that plague each region. And this lays out for a possible dialogue between countries to jointly tackle maritime threats from both state and non-state actors, including natural disasters. The fourth point, that the marine environment and marine resources needed to be conserved, highlighting pollution from plastic waste and oil spills, where we are seeing a renewed discussion on both oil spills and plastic waste because of recent events that took place in Gulf of Mexico and in Indian Ocean because of oil spills near Sri Lanka and in US near Gulf of Mexico. The fifth point that was laid by Mr. Modi during the debate is responsible maritime connectivity, saying a structure was required to boost maritime trade with the development of global norms and standards. These are the 5 points that was laid out by our Prime Minister in the debate on maritime security. To just refresh your memory, Sagar, right? Sagar is the security and growth for all in the region, which is a framework for regional maritime security launched by India in 2015. Right, through Sagar, India seeks to deepen economic and security cooperation with its maritime neighbors and assist in building their maritime security capabilities. This talks about India funding infrastructure projects in those countries and enhancing and augmenting their marine security capabilities, right? Sagar kind of assumes a significant role in India's foreign policy, where if seen in conjunction with India's other policies that impact the maritime domain, like Act East Policy, Project Sagarmala, Project Mosam. This is kind of India's assuming the role of net security provider to these countries in Indian Ocean region, and also focuses on economy. Not only talks about the security aspect of it, but it also talks about the economic aspect of it, particularly related to blue economy. So this is UNSC's debate on maritime security. These are the 5 points put forward by our Prime Minister during the debate, which was attended by various heads of the state, including Russian President Vladimir Putin. And that is where we are trying to kind of relaunch Sagar at international forum as an hedge to the Chinese projects, Chinese policies that are trying to circumnavigate us. So these kinds of give a lot of significance to Sagar in the coming few months. If acted in conjunction with other policies in the maritime domain, we will see a renewed policy approach from India to its IOTR neighbors. Thank you. Stay safe. Namaste.
Borthakur IAS Academy. প্রস্তুতি আৰু অধ্যয়নৰ নিৰ্ভৰযোগ্য ঠিকনা। Borthakur IAS Academy.